Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we are discussing Dividend Island, an incredibly thoughtful and meticulously assembled documentary that seeks to unpack the Cyprus problem, the tension between Greek and Turkish Cypriots in partition Cyprus. The documentary interviews historians, political scientists, and utilizes archival footage. It also has this subtle score that adds tension to the narration. However, what makes this documentary unique is it interviews Turkish and Greek Cypriots who recount the violence their families suffered at the height of this conflict. I felt the contrast between the historical narrative and these interviews provided for a unique opportunity to rethink and rewrite narratives that have harmed both sides. How certain eras are defined and retold greatly impact those who have lived it, and I felt like listening to these interviews, it made it clear that time does not heal all wounds, especially wounds that have been untreated for decades. The documentary is incredibly comprehensive. It begins before the British occupation of Cyprus and ends with the partition as it exists today. The history of Cyprus is unique and also not that different from a lot of countries following the end of colonial rule. Cyprus is a mosaic of different cultures, beliefs, and values, and this characteristic is key to Cypriot identity. This, of course, would later be weaponized to divide and conquer the island. I felt the documentary gave equal time to Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and as a result, this created a empathy for both sides. On paper, you want to side with one over the other. Although both sides committed atrocities and both sides were perpetrators, it's very clear that the Turkish have had to bear the brunt of this pain. However, the way the documentary is organized, it tries to use the past to encourage a solution, like where do we go from here? Although these atrocities happened decades earlier, the way that Greek and Turkish Cypriots recount their stories, it's as if it happened yesterday. The pain, the grief, it all remains the same. There are so many lives that have gone unaccounted for and unacknowledged, and the fear is if they go accounted for and acknowledged, this would create a conflict much worse than those in the past. One of the questions this documentary asks is who benefits from division on this island? This place is way too small to be having this many problems. At the moment, there is no infrastructure for peace or reconciliation on the island. There's really nothing that has been facilitated to allow people to speak about their own trauma. Most of these efforts have been grassroots, and the documentary does interview activists who are more interested in uniting Cypriots according to their commonalities and not their differences. And these movements have been very useful in unearthing a lot of mass graves and allowing for families to mourn their loved ones and get the closure that they so desperately were looking for. And I think a part of the issue is if you hide the grave, you hide the crime, and therefore you shield the criminal. And one expert in the documentary notes how because so many of these atrocities have been downplayed or just not talked about, even if people wanted to forgive and forget, they don't actually know what to forgive or forget. And as a result, the infrastructure in place does not allow for peace and reconciliation. Instead, it allows for further violence. Despite all the efforts by activists, the number of nationalistic and right-wing movements have increased. And with the state of the world as it is today, it just feels inevitable that conflict in this island will resume. One of my favorite parts of this documentary is when one of the experts explains the effect of colonial rule, like the psychological effect, specifically the success of divide and conquer. People who are divided are more likely to act from a place of fear instead of compassion and understanding. The degree of generational trauma caused by being displaced and relocated has left a deep scar. And listening to Turkish and Greek Cypriots, I really felt empathy for both sides, and I totally understand the logic of an eye for an eye. However, as one expert noted, if we resort to this method, the world will go blind. The partition of Cyprus has been a diplomatic nightmare. And I do think diplomacy works if you actually get both sides to sit down and concede to things they otherwise would not concede to and just come up with really tough agreements. However, the international community is more interested in preserving their own interests than trying to find a sustainable solution. I think building trust between Turkish and Greek Cypriots is an uphill battle, especially if one side has been socially and economically isolated. I think this documentary explains very clearly why history repeats itself. One of my favorite archival footage in this documentary is of a UN meeting, and one UN representative describes how if we don't find a solution for this problem, our deliberations will go from inquiry to autopsy. And it's hard to listen to all these personal stories and think this frozen conflict will not melt over at some time. Now, when it melts, we're not sure. What will happen is up in the air. One of the activists made it clear that it's really up to those in Cyprus to come up with a solution and unite. And it might be just a generational issue, because usually younger generations don't really like conflict. Because if they don't come up with a solution, it's very clear that the outside world does not want them to. And I really appreciated this documentary because not only does it unpack the Cyprus problem, it also analyzes the impact of colonial rule and how so much of this tension is outside of them. And overall, I highly recommend this documentary. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.